The storm had finally broken, leaving behind pulverized pine. Inside the dim, wreckage-strewn foreman's office, Clara's trembling hands finally steadied as she finished wrapping the bloody, improvised bandage around Hayes's scarred torso. For the first time, his gruff, abrasive mask was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, burning gaze that pinned her in place. The undeniable spark between them flared into a raging fire as he reached out to touch her. "Hey, lovers. You're back at Tiana's Collections. Before we get to know about today's tense new story, I want to take a quick second to connect with my fellow shifter lovers. We have listeners tuning in from all over the world, and I'd love to know where you are joining from today. Drop your city or country in the comments below. I read every single one, and I love seeing how far our park strives. Grab a popcorn and get cozy. Chapter 1. The iron tasted like blood and rust against Clara's cheek. She didn't know how long she'd been clinging to the base of the massive, wrought iron gate, only that the mud sucking at her boots felt like wet concrete, and her lungs were burning with every ragged pull of air. She pressed a trembling hand to her stomach, silently cursing the aristocratic nightmare she was running from. Not exactly a baby moon, she wheezed, her voice swallowed instantly by the roaring Pacific Northwest wind. Heavy, methodical footsteps vibrated through the freezing slush. Not a tracker. Too loud. Too heavy. A flashlight beam cut through the deluge, blinding her instantly. "Unless you're a remarkably ugly stray cat, you're trespassing," a voice rumbled. It wasn't a voice built for polite conversation. It sounded like gravel grinding through a wood chipper. Clara squinted against the glare, her freezing fingers instinctively curling around a jagged fistful of gravel. "And unless you're the gatekeeper to hell, you need to turn off that blinding—" The beam dropped, revealing a pair of steel-toed boots that looked roughly the size of small sedans. Her gaze dragged upward, past a terrifying expanse of rain-slicked flannel and heavily scarred forearms, settling on a face that belonged on a wanted poster. He was massive, bearded, and staring at her with an expression of profound irritation. "Private property," the giant grunted, crossing his arms over a chest broad enough to block the wind. The rain seemed to actively avoid him. "Read the sign." "I would," Clara spat back, her teeth chattering so hard her jaw ached. "But I left my reading glasses in the trunk of the car I had to abandon 3 days ago. Now, are you going to open this gate, or am I going to have to bleed to death on your decorative ironwork?" Hayes's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, the sheer physical gravity of him making Clara's survival instincts scream. He reached down. "Don't touch me," she snarled, launching the handful of wet gravel directly at his face. It bounced harmlessly off his cheekbone. He didn't even blink. "Are you insane? Or just universally annoying?" he asked, wiping a smudge of mud from his jaw with a heavily calloused thumb. "A healthy mix of both," she gasped, trying to scramble backward, but her legs finally gave out. The sheer, frantic adrenaline that had carried her across 3 state lines evaporated, leaving nothing but bone-deep exhaustion when the world tilted sideways. "Hey!" His voice lost the abrasive edge of annoyance, dropping into something dangerously close to concern as he lunged forward. Strong, impossibly warm hands gripped her shoulders. She tried to thrash, tried to summon one last sarcastic barb to keep him at bay, but the darkness was rushing in too fast. "Get away," she murmured, the words slurring together. "Stop fighting, Spitfire," he commanded, effortlessly lifting her against his chest as if she weighed no more than a wet leaf. The intense, grounding heat radiating from him was the last thing she registered before the blackness swallowed her whole. Warmth. That was the first anomaly. Clara cracked a single eye open. The oppressive roar of the storm was muffled, replaced by the heavy, rhythmic crackle of a massive hearth. She was lying on a bed large enough to sleep a family of 4, wrapped tightly in a heavy quilt that smelled aggressively of cedar and wood smoke. Her panic spiked instantly. She shot up, her head spinning dizzily, and scrambled off the mattress. Her muddy boots were gone. Her ruined jacket was draped over a heavy timber chair. "Okay, Goldilocks, think," she muttered to herself, her eyes darting around the cavernous, log-paneled cabin. It was aggressively masculine. Axes mounted on the walls, worn leather, zero-throw pillows. Her gaze landed on the fireplace. Beside it rested a heavy wrought-iron fire poker. She lunged for it, the cold metal grounding her racing heart. She backed into the furthest corner, raising the weapon over her shoulder like a baseball bat, her breath hitching in her throat. She needed an exit. The window was hammered shut, rain lashing violently against the thick glass. The heavy oak door swung open with a dull creak. Hayes stepped inside. He had stripped off his wet jacket, wearing only a clingy, sweat-soaked thermal shirt that did absolutely nothing to hide the thick, jagged scars crisscrossing his chest and neck. But that wasn't what made Clara's grip tighten on the iron poker until her knuckles turned white. From his knuckles to his elbows, Hayes was completely drenched in fresh, dark blood. He stopped, his dark eyes locking onto her. He looked at the raised poker, then up to her wide, terrified eyes. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely exhausted. "I wouldn't swing that," Hayes rumbled, his voice low and dangerous in the quiet room. "You'll pull a muscle, and I've already done enough patching up for one night." Chapter 2. Clara stared at the blood. The fire poker suddenly felt ridiculously inadequate, like bringing a toothpick to a chainsaw fight. "Whose blood is that?" she demanded, her voice a brittle wire pulled far too tight. She didn't lower the iron. Hayes exhaled, a heavy, grating sound that seemed to rattle deep within his massive chest. He stepped further into the cabin, peeling the ruined, wet thermal shirt over his head. The movement made Clara flinch, but she couldn't tear her eyes away. The man was a living tapestry of violence. Thick, ropey scars crisscrossed his torso, a brutal, unspoken history written in raised skin. But the fresh blood was welling from a jagged, nasty gash along his left bicep. "A wild animal," Hayes muttered, tossing the bloody shirt onto the stone hearth. He walked over to a heavy wooden wash basin, splashing cold water over his neck. Got tangled in some downed wire near the perimeter. "Now, put the antique down before you break a lamp." Clara laughed, a dry, hollow sound. "An animal did that?" Her grip tightened on the iron. "What kind of animal uses a straight razor? Because that cut is terrifyingly precise." He froze. Slowly, he turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The sheer, brooding intensity of his stare made the air in the room feel suddenly, dangerously thin. "You ask entirely too many questions for a woman who washed up in my mud like a half-drowned rat," he said, grabbing a rough towel and pressing it to his bleeding arm. He winced. A tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of his jaw. Clara watched him struggle to tie a makeshift bandage with one hand. It was a pathetic attempt. The massive, arrogant lumberjack was bleeding all over his expensive Persian rug, clearly too stubborn to ask for help. "You're going to bleed out," she stated, slowly lowering the fire poker to lean it against the stone mantel. "And frankly, I don't have the energy to drag your corpse out of here." "I'm fine," he growled, ripping a strip of linen with his teeth. "You're an idiot," Clara countered. She crossed the room before she could overthink the sheer proximity of him. The scent of him hit her instantly, a dizzying, overwhelming mix of crushed pine needles, cold rain, and the sharp, metallic tang of blood. She swatted his hand away. "Sit down." Hayes blinked, genuinely taken aback by the absolute lack of hesitation in her voice. He looked down at her. She barely reached his chest, and for a second, she thought he might actually throw her back out into the storm. Instead, he slowly lowered his massive frame onto the edge of the mattress. Clara grabbed a clean cloth and a bottle of clear rubbing alcohol from a nearby side table. "This is going to sting," she warned. "I've had worse," he murmured. She poured the alcohol. He didn't even flinch. As she carefully began to clean the wound, her trembling fingers inevitably brushed against the warm, hard expanse of his arm. His skin was rough, radiating a heat that seeped directly into her freezing bones, forcing a terrifying sense of safety onto her exhausted mind. "You never answered my question," Hayes said softly, the abrasive edge of his voice entirely gone. "Who are you running from?" Clara pulled the bandage tight, securing it with a sharp tug that earned a low, near rumbling grunt from him. "No one you need to worry about." "I own everything within a 50-mile radius of this cabin," he countered, his gaze dropping to her mouth. "If it's in my woods, I worry about it." The tension in the room spiked, thick and combustible. She opened her mouth to deliver a perfectly crafted sarcastic deflection. Bang, bang, bang. Someone was hammering frantically on the heavy oak door. Hayes was on his feet instantly, his relaxed posture vanishing, replaced by lethal readiness. He yanked the door open. A soaked, terrified-looking man stood on the porch, gasping for breath over the roar of the wind. "Boss!" the foreman panted, his eyes wide with panic. "The main gorge. The access bridge. It just completely washed out." Hayes went perfectly still. "We're trapped," the foreman finished, the words hanging like an executioner's axe. "Trapped." The word echoed in the cavernous, wood-paneled cabin, instantly sucking all the oxygen from the room. The foreman stood dripping onto the Persian rug, trembling under the weight of his own announcement. Hayes didn't blink. He didn't flinch. Instead, his massive frame seemed to physically expand, absorbing the panic and turning it into a cold, terrifyingly hard authority. "Get the backup generators primed," Hayes ordered, his voice a low, vibrating rumble that brooked absolutely zero argument. "Nobody goes past the tree line. Nobody. You buddy up if you have to take a leak. If a shadow moves, you light it up." "Yes, boss," the foreman stammered, backing out into the deluge and pulling the heavy oak door shut behind him. Hayes threw the thick iron deadbolt with a resounding clack. He turned back to Clara, and all traces of the quietly brooding man who had just allowed her to stitch his bleeding arm were entirely gone. In his place was a warlord assessing his battlements. "You," he said, pointing a heavy, calloused finger directly at her chest. "Stay exactly where you are. Do not touch the fire. Do not open the door. If someone knocks and it isn't my voice on the other side, you don't make a sound." Clara crossed her arms, her sarcastic shield slamming back into place with the force of a steel trap. "Wow. Do I get a designated bathroom schedule, or should I just hold it until you fully establish your totalitarian regime?" He closed the distance between them in 2 terrifyingly fast strides. He invaded her personal space, his chest mere inches from hers. The oppressive heat radiating off his scarred skin was intoxicating, a sharp, dizzying contrast to the freezing draft leaking through the window panes. He smelled of ozone, crushed pine needles, and an absolute, unyielding need for control. "I am trying to keep you alive," Hayes growled, his gaze dropping involuntarily to her mouth before snapping harshly back to her eyes. "My woods are currently a death trap. You will stay in this cabin. Am I understood?" "I don't do well with cages," she fired back, tilting her chin up, refusing to step away, refusing to let him see the sheer terror clawing at her throat. even the ones decorated in dead animals and excessive plaid. It's not a cage. It's a vault, he corrected smoothly, his voice dropping an octave. And you're staying in it. He grabbed a heavy canvas coat from an iron hook and walked out, pulling the door shut behind him. A second later, the distinct metallic snick of a heavy padlock sliding into place on the outside made Clara's blood run instantly. Violently cold. Locked in. Her breath hitched. The walls of the massive cabin suddenly felt like they were inching inward, the rich cedar scent turning suffocating. It was the exact same sickening panic she had felt 3 days ago in the pristine, marble-floored penthouse she had barely escaped. Only the aesthetic had changed. She had traded a psychotic, silver spoon aristocrat for an arrogant lumberjack with a massive hero complex. Absolutely not, she whispered to the empty room. She began pacing the length of the rug, her mind racing. She needed a weapon. She needed leverage. She started tearing through the cabin, yanking open heavy mahogany drawers and rifling through leather-bound journals on his desk. What she found made her freeze. This wasn't the den of an uneducated mountain man. The bookshelf wasn't filled with hunting catalogs. It was lined with first-edition texts on global macroeconomics, advanced forestry engineering, and heavily dog-eared copies of ancient philosophy. She yanked open a bottom drawer, her trembling fingers brushing against a heavy velvet box. Inside lay a pristine, absurdly expensive platinum watch, the exact kind her ex used to bribe politicians. Beneath it rested a folded piece of heavy cardstock, a degree, summa cum laude, from one of the most ruthless Ivy League business schools in the country. "Who exactly are you hiding from, Hayes?" she murmured, tracing the embossed lettering. He wasn't just a lumberjack. He was a billionaire playing blue-collar in the mud. The storm outside shrieked, rattling the thick glass. Clara slammed the drawer shut. She couldn't stay here. The claustrophobia was paralyzing her, making her heart hammer wildly against her ribs. She moved to the back of the cabin, finding a small ventilation window above the clawfoot bathtub. The latch was rusted, but not locked. Wrapping her hands in a thick towel, she forced the heavy iron latch upward with a desperate, agonizing shove. It gave way with a screech. She shimmied through the narrow frame, scraping her sides, and dropped into the freezing, waist-high mud behind the cabin. The rain hit her like icy shrapnel, instantly soaking her through. She took exactly 2 steps toward the tree line before a body slammed violently into hers. Clara shrieked, scrambling backward in the mud, her hands raised into fists. But it wasn't a tracker. It was a young logger, his face ghostly pale beneath a layer of grime. He was hyperventilating, his eyes wide and unseeing as he scrambled on all fours. "He's gone!" The boy screamed into the storm, clawing frantically at his own rain slicker. "The rig is smashed to hell and Miller is just gone." "What do you mean, gone?" Clara shouted over the howling wind, grabbing the terrified boy by the shoulders to stop his frantic thrashing. Before the logger could answer, a massive hand clamped down on Clara's arm, hauling her backward with terrifying, effortless strength. Hayes. He looked utterly murderous. "I explicitly told you to stay inside," he roared over the thunder, his dark eyes flashing with a fury that made the storm seem polite. "I am not a dog you can leave tied to a porch," Clara screamed back, ripping her arm from his grip. "And I don't care how many expensive degrees you have hidden in your desk. You don't get to lock me in a box." Hayes flinched, a minuscule tightening of his jaw at the mention of his desk, but the panicked logger broke the tension before it could detonate. "Boss!" the boy sobbed, pointing a shaking finger toward the impenetrable blackness of the northern ridge. "Miller didn't check in. I hiked up to Sector 4. The feller buncher. It's destroyed. It looks like a bomb went off." Hayes's entire demeanor shifted. The anger vanished. replaced by an icy, lethal calculation. He looked at Clara, covered in mud and trembling violently in the freezing rain. He couldn't lock her back in the cabin. She'd just break another window. And he couldn't leave her unguarded. "You want to be out in the mud, Spitfire?" Hayes growled, unhooking a heavy, high-powered flashlight from his belt. "Fine. Stay exactly one step behind me. If I stop, you stop. If I run, you run." Clara swallowed hard, nodding once. The hike up the ridge was pure agony. The mud sucked at her boots, threatening to drag her under, but Hayes positioned his massive body perfectly, acting as a relentless, broad-shouldered shield against the worst of the wind. Even in the freezing deluge, the heat rolling off him was a palpable magnetic force. When they finally breached the crest of the hill, the beam of Hayes's flashlight illuminated a scene of absolute devastation. The Fellerbuncher, a machine the size of a 2-story house, built of solid steel and heavy treads, lay on its side in a crater of pulverized mud. The reinforced glass cab was entirely shattered. "Bear," Hayes muttered, sweeping the light over the wreckage. "Or a widowmaker branch came down and smashed the hydraulics." Clara ignored his command to stay back. She slipped under his arm, stepping closer to the shredded underbelly of the beast. She squinted through the rain, her eyes tracing the severed, thick black hoses bleeding hydraulic fluid into the puddles. "A bear didn't do this," she said, her voice eerily calm. "Clara, step back." "Look at the hoses, Hayes," she interrupted, pointing a shaking, mud-caked finger at the thick rubber lines. "They aren't torn. They aren't crushed by a falling branch." Hayes stepped up beside her, his thigh brushing against her hip. He lowered the beam of light. The edges of the thick rubber were perfectly, cleanly sliced. "Those were cut with a thermal blade," Clara whispered, the blood draining from her face. "And the main control panel." She pointed to a smoking, blackened mess of wires inside the shattered cab. "That's an EMP burn. They shorted out the radio so Miller couldn't call for help before they took him." Hayes slowly turned to look down at her, the disbelief entirely overriding his usual arrogance. "Where the hell did you learn to identify an EMP burn? When you spend your entire life locked in expensive cages surrounded by heavily armed guards," Clara laughed, a bitter, fragile sound. "You learn exactly how the locks work, and how to break them." A sudden, violent crack of thunder directly overhead forced them both to dive for cover. Hayes grabbed her waist, dragging her into a tiny, dry observation blind tucked beneath the massive roots of an overturned redwood. The space was impossibly small. Clara was pressed flush against his chest, her back against the damp earth. In the enclosed dark, his scent was overwhelming. Pure, intoxicating alpha heat that made her exhausted muscles involuntarily relax. She could feel the heavy, rapid thumping of his heart against her collarbone. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the sarcasm finally breaking. "They aren't here for your lumber. They're here for me." Hayes didn't answer. He was staring out through the narrow gap in the roots, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. Clara followed his gaze out into the mud. There, knee illuminated by a brilliant flash of lightning, was a line of deep, heavy boot prints leading away from the wreckage. They weren't the erratic, slipping tracks of a terrified logger. They were perfectly spaced, synchronized, military precision. And as the rain hammered down, the edges of the perfect tracks began to wash away, erasing the only proof that the monsters were already inside the gates. The tracks washed away into nothing but flat, featureless mud. Clara stared at the puddle, the icy rain plastering her hair to her forehead, but she couldn't feel the cold anymore. All she felt was the crushing, suffocating weight of inevitability. "Rival crew," Hayes grunted, finally breaking the heavy silence inside the cramped observation blind. His voice vibrated against her shoulder. O'Connor's men have been trying to push my borders for 6 months. They want the redwood contracts. Scaring my scouts is a cheap tactic. Clara whipped her head around to look at him, her incredulity temporarily overriding her exhaustion. Are you intentionally blinding yourself? Or is it just a byproduct of that massive ego? Loggers don't use military-grade EMPs. They don't move in synchronized tactical formations. You saw a boot print in the mud for exactly 3 seconds. He shot back, his tone dropping into a dangerous, low warning. He shifted his weight, his massive thigh pressing fully against hers in the confined space under the roots. The sheer heat radiating from him was staggering, a furnace burning right through her wet clothes. I know these woods, Clara. I know the threats out here. You know your threats, she countered, her voice trembling, not from the freezing wind, but from a sudden, sharp spike of fury. It was the same dismissive, arrogant tone her ex used whenever she voiced a concern. Don't worry your pretty head about it. You have absolutely no idea what mine look like. Hayes's jaw clenched. He reached out, his thick, calloused fingers wrapping firmly around her upper arm to pull her out of the blind. We are going back. Now. The hike down the ridge was a brutal, silent war. The bickering started the moment they hit the main logging trail. If O'Connor wanted to bankrupt you, he'd burn your lumber yard, not kidnap a single scout, Clara argued, slipping on a patch of slick clay. Hayes caught her before she hit the ground, his grip entirely too gentle for the lethal expression on his face. Logistics. Spitfire. Without scouts, I can't operate the heavy machinery safely in this storm. The contracts default. It's a surgical strike to blind the camp, she yelled over a massive crack of thunder. You're thinking like a businessman. You need to think like a hunter. He whirled on her, his patience finally snapping. I am the only hunter on this mountain. Above them, an agonizing, concussive crack split the air. Hayes didn't even look up. His reflexes were horrifyingly fast. He lunged, wrapping both arms around her waist, and tackled her entirely off the trail. They slammed into the soft, rain-soaked earth just as a massive, dead redwood branch, the size of a telephone pole, crashed exactly where they had been standing seconds before, burying itself 3 feet deep into the mud. Clara gasped, the breath completely knocked out of her lungs. She was pinned flat against the trunk of another tree, entirely encased by Hayes's massive frame. He had taken the brunt of the fall, shielding her body with his own. For a long, suffocating moment, neither of them moved. The heavy, rhythmic thumping of his heart was hammering directly against her chest. She looked up. His face was inches from hers. The rainwater dripped from his dark beard onto her cheek. His chest heaved, his dark eyes wide, pupils completely blown as he scanned her face for injuries. The scent of him, sharp ozone, crushed pine, and pure, intoxicating adrenaline, wiped her mind entirely blank. The argument evaporated. The air between them suddenly felt thicker than the mud. "Are you hurt?" he murmured, his voice a hoarse, gravelly rasp that sent an involuntary shiver straight down her spine. "No," she breathed, it's entirely unable to look away from his mouth. He stared at her for a second too long, the tension shifting from adrenaline to something dark, heavy, and dangerously magnetic. Slowly, reluctantly, he pushed himself up, pulling her to her feet without another word. The walk back to the compound was utterly silent, the unspoken charge between them crackling louder than the lightning. But when they finally pushed through the heavy iron gates, the tension shattered. The mess hall, usually roaring with the voices of 50 off-shift loggers, was dead silent. The heavy oak door was swinging wildly in the wind. Hayes drew a heavy hunting knife from his belt. "Stay behind me." They stepped inside. The hall was empty. Dinner was still smoking on the long wooden tables, but on the floor near the back exit, Hayes's foreman was kneeling in the sawdust and staring at a discarded, mud-caked radio. "Boss," the foreman whispered, looking up with entirely hollow eyes. "Davis is gone. They took the second scout." Before the foreman's words could fully settle into the horrified silence of the mess hall, the overhead halogen lights buzzed violently and died. Total, impenetrable blackness slammed into them. Clara gasped, stumbling backward until her shoulders hit the solid, unyielding wall of Hayes's chest. He didn't push her away. Instead, his free hand came up in the dark, his thick fingers wrapping securely around her hip, anchoring her to him. The sheer possessive weight of his touch sent a jolt of heat straight through her freezing, soaked clothes. "Perimeter breach," Hayes commanded, his voice slicing through the dark like a serrated edge. "Lock the mess hall doors, and arm yourselves with whatever you can find in the kitchen. Nobody moves until I get the backup grid online." Clara felt his hand leave her hip, an immediate, chilling loss of heat, as he moved toward the exit. "Where are you going?" she demanded, her voice tight. "Utility shed," Hayes grunted, a heavy flashlight snapping on, casting brutal, long shadows across the empty tables. "The main generator just blew. I have to manually crank the auxiliary." "You're not going alone," Clara said, already stepping into the beam of light. "You are staying here with the crew." "Unless your crew is suddenly armed with automatic weapons, I'm staying with the guy who has the knife and the flashlight," she shot back, her sarcastic shield slamming perfectly back into place. "Besides, you're a billionaire who plays with wood for a living. What do you know about fixing a heavy-duty diesel engine?" Hayes paused, the beam of light illuminating his rigid jaw. A slow, deeply reluctant smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "More than a spoiled runaway Spitfire. Keep up." The utility shed was a concrete bunker located 50 yards past the mess hall. The wind howled like a dying animal as they sprinted across the compound, Hayes physically shielding her from the worst of the flying debris. Inside the shed, the stench of old oil and fried rubber was instantly overwhelming. Hayes slammed the heavy metal door shut, drowning out the storm. He aimed the flashlight at a massive, hulking piece of machinery in the center of the room. The primary generator was smoking heavily. "Pass me the heavy wrench from that wall," Hayes ordered, and already unbuttoning his soaked flannel shirt to get a better angle on the access panel. Clara grabbed the tool, moving to stand beside him. In the enclosed, windowless bunker, his scent was heavily concentrated. Musk, sweat, and that undeniable alpha heat. He grunted, straining against a rusted bolt. "Damn it, the intake valve is jammed. If I can't clear it, the auxiliary won't catch." Clara leaned over his arm, shining the flashlight directly into the blackened grate. "Move," she said simply. "Clara, I don't have time for your—" "Move your massive, heavily scarred ego out of the way, Hayes," she interrupted, shoving her shoulder against his. "Your hands are too big. You can't reach the clearance flap without stripping the threading." He blinked, staring at her in the dim light. Slowly, he stepped back, crossing his arms over his broad, exposed chest. "Be my guest." Clara rolled up her wet sleeves, plunging her hands directly into the greasy, blackened belly of the engine. She twisted her wrist awkwardly, searching blindly in the dark machinery. The silence in the shed was absolute, save for their breathing. "Little to the left," Hayes murmured, leaning in close. His chest brushed against her back. The sudden, intense proximity sent a shock wave of electricity straight to her toes. He wasn't hovering to control her. He was watching her with absolute, undivided fascination. "Got it," she breathed. She yanked hard. Something gave way with a metallic snap. "Now hit the ignition," she said, pulling her hands out, completely coated in thick, black grease. Hayes slammed his hand onto the heavy red button on the wall. The engine sputtered, coughed violently, and then roared to life. The overhead bulb flickered, buzzing violently before flooding the concrete bunker with harsh, yellow light. Clara let out a shaky laugh, holding up her grease-stained hands. "See? I'm not entirely useless." Hayes didn't laugh. He wasn't looking at her face. His dark eyes were fixed on the intake grate she had just cleared. Clara followed his gaze. Snagged on the jagged metal edge of the intake fan, fluttering slightly in the engine's exhaust, was a torn piece of fabric. It wasn't flannel. It wasn't standard-issue logging canvas. It was a shred of pristine, jet-black tactical weave, threaded with an incredibly expensive, highly reflective silver microfiber. Clara's breath completely vanished from her lungs. The world tilted dangerously on its axis. The heavy, or rhythmic thumping of the diesel engine suddenly sounded exactly like a ticking clock. Clara stared at the torn fabric, her grease-stained hands trembling violently. The sarcastic shield she had so carefully constructed over the past 3 days shattered entirely, dissolving into ash. "What is it?" Hayes demanded. His voice was sharp, cutting through her spiraling panic. He reached out, his massive fingers plucking the silver-threaded scrap from the metal grate. He rubbed the material between his thumb and forefinger, his brow furrowing. "This isn't O'Connor's crew. This is Ballistic Weave." "It's an elite private security firm," Clara whispered, the words scraping painfully against her dry throat. "They call them the Silver Hounds. They don't track bounties. They track assets." Hayes's head snapped up, on his dark eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. The abrasive lumberjack was entirely gone. The man staring at her now was the billionaire tactician, the ruthless mind that had conquered boardrooms before retreating to the woods. "Your ex," Hayes stated. It wasn't a question. Clara took a step backward, her spine hitting the cold concrete wall of the bunker. "He didn't just send thugs, Hayes. He sent his personal kill squad. They disabled the heavy machinery. They're picking off your scouts to blind the perimeter. They're systematically dismantling your entire operation just to trap me here." Her chest heaved. The claustrophobia from the cabin returned, 1,000 times worse. She was a plague, dragging death straight to the doorstep of a man who had done nothing but offer her a fire and a sarcastic remark. "Say, I have to go," she gasped, her eyes darting frantically toward the heavy metal door. "If I leave the compound, if I surrender, they'll stop. They'll leave your crew alone." She bolted for the door. She didn't even make it 2 steps. Hayes moved with a speed that defied his massive bulk. He intercepted her, his arms wrapping around her waist, spinning her around and slamming her back against the concrete wall. He didn't hit her hard, but he pinned her there perfectly, his heavy forearms braced on either side of her head, completely trapping her in the cage of his body. "Let me go!" she shrieked, hitting his solid chest with her grease-slicked hands. "You don't understand what he does to people who get in his way. He will slaughter everyone on this mountain." "Stop!" Hayes roared, the sound echoing violently off the concrete walls. Clara flinched, closing her eyes, waiting for the inevitable dismissal, the disgust, the demand that she leave his property immediately. Instead, Hayes's head dropped forward until his forehead rested heavily against hers. His breathing was harsh, ragged, washing over her face in heated, frantic bursts. The anger in him was gone, replaced by a raw, terrifyingly violent need to protect. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice dropping to a gravelly, vibrating whisper that settled deep into her bones. Clara slowly opened her eyes. His face was inches away, completely stripped of its usual gruff indifference. His dark eyes were burning with an intensity that made her breath hitch all over again. "You are not surrendering to anyone," Hayes said, emphasizing every single word with lethal precision. "This is my territory, my mountain, and I do not give up what belongs under my protection." "Hayes, you can't fight them," she sobbed, a single tear cutting a clean line through the soot on her cheek. "They are armed. They are trained for this." Hayes lifted his hand, his calloused thumb gently wiping the tear away, smearing a streak of engine grease across her cheekbone. The touch was impossibly gentle, a stark, dizzying contrast to the sheer violence radiating from his massive frame. "I survived corporate warfare in the most cutthroat cities in the world, and I built an empire in a forest that actively tries to kill me every single winter," Hayes murmured, his gaze dropping to her trembling lips before dragging back up to her terrified eyes. He stepped back, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the heavy iron keys to the compound's armory. "You aren't a runaway anymore, Spitfire," Hayes growled, a dark, terrifyingly arrogant smirk finally breaking across his face. "You're bait, and we're going to hunt them." The heavy iron door of the camp's supply bunker shrieked in protest as Hayes forced it open, the rusted hinges losing their battle against his sheer, terrifying strength. Inside, the air was bitterly cold, smelling sharply of grease, cut steel, and old earth. It wasn't a military armory. There were no racks of automatic weapons. Instead, the walls were lined with heavy-duty flare guns, high-powered tranquilizer rifles meant for rogue bears, and rows of wickedly sharp felling axes. "O'Connor's crew is one thing," the foreman, Miller, stammered, staring at the meager arsenal. He was shivering violently in his soaked canvas coat. "But boss, now if they're a private kill squad, we're bringing chainsaws to a gunfight." Hayes didn't answer immediately. He reached for a massive, double-bitted felling axe, the heavy steel gleaming under the harsh beam of his flashlight. He weighed it in his hands, a man entirely comfortable with violence, before slamming it down onto the wooden workbench. "They expect us to be blind, disorganized, and terrified," Hayes rumbled, his voice cutting through the panic in the room like a physical weight. He turned his dark, intense gaze toward the corner of the bunker. "But they don't know who we have." Every eye in the room shifted to Clara. She was shivering, her wet hair plastered to her skull, her clothes coated in engine grease and freezing mud. By all metrics, she looked like a completely broken runaway. But as Hayes deferred to her, the undisputed alpha of this mountain yielding the floor, something inside Clara snapped completely into focus. She wasn't a victim hiding behind a locked door anymore. She was part of a pack. Clara pushed off the concrete wall, stepping into the center of the hardened loggers. "The Silverhounds are entirely reliant on their technology," she began, her voice remarkably steady despite the adrenaline clawing at her throat. "They move in synchronized pairs. They use thermal imaging scopes to cut through the storm, and they rely on localized radio grids to coordinate. But their biggest weakness is their arrogance. They think you are uneducated grunts." She walked over to the workbench, picking up a heavy, industrial-grade thermal cutting torch. "We are going to weaponize this mountain," Clara commanded, dropping the sarcasm entirely. "If they have thermals, we build massive bonfires of green wood around the perimeter to blind their scopes with a heat wall. We take the heavy logging chains and rig trip lines across the main access roads. They expect you to run, so we are going to make them bleed for every single inch of mud they step on." Hayes stared at her, an expression of profound, awestruck respect washing over his scarred features. He didn't just see a woman he needed to protect. He saw an equal. You heard the spitfire, he growled to the men. Move out. Hours later, the camp was a fortified nightmare. Inside the dim, insulated quiet of the command center, Clara and Hayes stood bent over a massive topographical map of the mountain. The only light came from the flickering, battery-powered lantern on the desk. If they breach the North Ridge, they have to funnel through this ravine, Clara murmured, tracing a path on the paper. Hayes stood directly behind her. He was so close she could feel the steady, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest against her spine. The heat radiating off his massive frame was intoxicating, a heavy, grounding force that made her exhausted muscles involuntarily relax against him. It's a choke point, Hayes agreed, his voice dropping into a low, gravelly rasp right next to her ear. He reached past her to tap the map, his thick, calloused forearm brushing heavily against hers. The contact sent a sharp, dizzying jolt of electricity straight to her core. Clara swallowed hard, her breath hitching. She turned her head slightly. His face was mere inches away, his dark eyes fixated on her mouth, entirely forgetting the map, and the tension in the tiny room spiked, thick and combustible, swallowing all the oxygen. Hayes, she whispered, entirely unsure if it was a warning or a plea. He leaned in, the scent of crushed pine and pure, dark adrenaline washing over her. Screech! The deafening, mechanical shriek of the North Ridge perimeter alarm violently shattered the silence. The red warning lights on the console flared to life, casting the small room in a sickly, pulsing crimson glow. They were here. Lock the reinforced door behind me, Hayes ordered, already strapping a heavy tactical rig over his dark thermal shirt. He shoved a high-powered flare gun into his holster and grabbed his felling axe. The abrasive lumberjack was entirely gone, replaced by a terrifyingly cold predator. You cannot go out there alone, Clara argued, seeing her heart hammering wildly against her ribs as she chased him to the door of the command center. The red emergency lights bathed his heavily scarred face in shadow, making him look like a mythic god of war. They travel in pairs. It's suicide. I know this terrain blindly. They don't, Hayes fired back. He grabbed a heavy industrial radio headset from the console and shoved it into her hands. You are my eyes, Clara. The sensors on the North Ridge are still active. Guide me. Do not let me walk into a crossfire. Clara stared at the heavy plastic headset, the crushing weight of his absolute trust instantly bringing tears to her eyes. He was subjugating his entire need for control, putting his life entirely in the hands of her tactical knowledge. If you die out there because you refuse to listen to my directions, I am going to resuscitate you just to kill you myself, she threatened, her voice cracking painfully on the last syllable. Hayes paused. He reached out, his massive, calloused hand cupping the back of her neck. He pulled her flush against his chest, pressing his lips fiercely to her forehead in a branding, desperate kiss. Stay on the comms, Spitfire, he murmured against her skin. Then he was gone, vanishing into the howling, pitch-black storm outside. Clara threw the heavy iron deadbolt on the door, her hands shaking violently. She sprinted back to the console, jamming the headset over her ears. The screens glowed a faint, ghostly green, mapping out the localized motion sensors Hayes had installed in the trees. One blip was moving fast. Hayes. Talk to me. Hayes's voice crackled through the headset. In the total darkness of the room, now his deep, breathless rumble sounded incredibly intimate, as if he were standing right over her shoulder. I have you, she breathed, her fingers flying over the keyboard. You are 200 yards from the tripped sensor. The wind is picking up. It's masking your approach. Do you see the target? Clara squinted at the pulsing green grid. The sensor on the ridge was blaring, but there was no secondary heat signature. The hounds couldn't hide their body heat from these specific industrial sensors. Nothing, she whispered, a sickening knot forming in her stomach. There's no mass at the breach point. Hayes, slow down. I'm at the perimeter line, he rasped, his breathing heavy in her ear. There's nobody here, Clara. The tripwire is snapped, but there are no tracks. Clara stared at the screen, and the realization hit her like a physical blow to the chest. Elite trackers didn't just snap tripwires clumsily. They bypassed them. Unless they wanted the alarm to go off. Unless they wanted the Alpha to leave the den entirely unguarded. Hayes, Clara gasped, the blood draining completely from her face. It's a trap. The alarm was a decoy. They aren't on the ridge. Clara? His voice cracked with sudden, violent panic over the radio. Clara, get out of the... Before he could finish the sentence, the entire console in front of her exploded in a shower of sparks. The heavy humming of the localized generator died instantly. The screens went pitch black. The power in the command center had just been cut from the outside. She was completely alone in the dark. The silence following the power cut was absolute, save for the rhythmic, violent lashing of the rain against the reinforced walls. Clara slowly pulled the dead headset from her ears, letting it drop to the floor. Her breath came in short, terrified gasps. She couldn't see her own hands in front of her face. The darkness was a physical, suffocating blanket. Clack. The sound was tiny, almost imperceptible beneath the thunder, but her hyper-vigilant mind isolated it instantly. It came from the air vent directly above the door. They hadn't breached the heavy iron lock. They had systematically dismantled the ventilation shaft. A heavy thud vibrated through the floorboards as someone dropped gracefully into the room. Clara pressed her back against the cold metal edge of the console, sliding silently down until she was crouching on the floor. Her mind raced. She had no weapon, no light. Shirk! The soft, metallic slide of a combat knife being drawn from a tactical sheath echoed in the small room. "We know you're in here, little bird," a voice purred in the darkness. It was incredibly smooth, chillingly calm, and entirely devoid of humanity. "The boss just wants you back. Come quietly, and we won't have to burn this charming little lumber camp to the ground." Clara's hands scrambled blindly across the bottom shelf of the console cart. Her fingers brushed against a heavy cast-iron skillet, the foreman's makeshift hot plate setup for late-night shifts. She gripped the handle perfectly. It easily weighed 10 pounds. "You know," Clara called out, her voice remarkably steady, dripping with weaponized sarcasm. "For an incredibly expensive elite assassin, your monologue is painfully cliché." The tracker shifted, his heavy boots grinding against the floorboards as he turned toward her voice. "You always did have a smart mouth. It's going to get you killed." "No," she shot back, silently shifting her weight to the balls of her feet in the pitch black. "It's going to get you killed, because you are hunting a pregnant Omega in the dark, and you forgot to check your blind spots." The tracker lunged toward the sound of her voice, a heavy flashlight snapping on attached to the barrel of a sidearm. The blinding beam caught her exactly where she was crouching, but Clara was already moving. Using every ounce of adrenaline in her exhausted body, she swung the cast-iron skillet upward with devastating force. The heavy iron connected perfectly with the tracker's jaw right as he reached for her. The sickening crunch of bone echoed over the thunder. The man crumpled instantly, his flashlight rolling uselessly across the floorboards. Clara stood over him, her chest heaving, the skillet still raised. She had actually done it. She had dropped a silver hound. Before she could even exhale, the heavy iron door of the command center was violently kicked off its hinges. The reinforced steel buckled and shrieked as Hayes practically tore the door from its frame. He stood in the threshold, utterly drenched, his felling axe dripping rain and mud. He looked like an absolute monster, his dark eyes sweeping the room wildly until they locked onto Clara. He dropped the axe. He crossed the room in 2 strides, falling to his knees and pulling her violently into his chest. His massive hands roamed over her face, her shoulders, checking desperately for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Hayes demanded, his voice completely wrecked, shaking with a terror he had never shown before. He crushed her against him, burying his face in her wet hair. "God, Clara, are you hurt?" "I'm okay," she choked out, wrapping her arms around his massive neck, completely surrendering to the overwhelming safety of his embrace. "I got him, Hayes. I got him." Hayes pulled back slightly, his thumb brushing a smudge of grease from her cheek, his eyes burning with an incredibly raw, possessive heat. He was about to speak, about to say the words they had both been dancing around for days. Crackle. The sound came from the unconscious tracker's tactical vest. A localized comms radio flared to life, a cold, aristocratic voice filtering through the static. "Decoy successful," the voice commanded, sending a spike of pure ice straight through Clara's veins. "Target located in the main command bunker. Initiate full breach. Leave no survivors." Leave no survivors. The aristocratic command hung in the stifling air of the command center, a chilling promise delivered through static. Hayes didn't hesitate. His heavy steel-toed boot came down with devastating force, pulverizing the comms radio and the tracker's tactical vest into a mess of cracked plastic and wires. The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Clara stood over the unconscious hound, the heavy iron skillet suddenly slipping from her trembling fingers to clang violently against the floorboards. The sarcastic shield she relied on was gone, completely incinerated. There was no room left for witty deflections when a private army was currently swarming the perimeter. "Hayes," she breathed, the word a fragile, terrified vapor in the cold air. He didn't speak. He crossed the ruined room in a single stride, his massive hands wrapping securely around her biceps. He hauled her against his chest, entirely ignoring the grease and mud caking her clothes. The sheer, overwhelming heat radiating from his heavy frame was a stark contrast to the ice running through her veins. "We are moving to the heavy lumber yard," Hayes commanded, his voice devoid of the abrasive lumberjack drawl. It was cold, lethal, calculated. "The outer buildings are made of pine and sheet metal. These bastards have thermal scopes and high-caliber rifles. We need cover that they can't shoot through." "The yard is a mile across," she protested, her heart hammering frantically against his sternum. "It's completely exposed." "Not in the stacks," he interrupted, his dark eyes burning with an intense, terrifying focus as he looked down at her. "The redwoods are 10 feet thick. They form a labyrinth. I know every blind corner. They don't. Now stay exactly behind me. If I drop, you drop." He grabbed his heavy felling axe from the floor, the steel gleaming wickedly in the faint glow of a dying monitor. He kicked the shattered iron door entirely out of the frame. The storm hit them like a physical wall. The wind shrieked, driving freezing rain perfectly sideways into their faces. Clara gasped, instantly blinded by the deluge. But Hayes was a relentless anchor. His hand gripped hers tightly, practically dragging her through the ankle-deep, freezing mud toward the center of the compound. A massive crack of lightning violently illuminated the sky, turning the night into stark and terrifying daylight for a fraction of a second. Clara's breath completely stalled in her throat. Lining the tree line, perfectly spaced and moving in absolute, terrifying synchronization, were dozens of silhouettes. The silver hounds had breached. They weren't sneaking anymore. They were marching forward like an execution squad. "Don't look at them!" Hayes roared over the thunder, his arm wrapping around her waist to physically lift her over a downed, sparking power line. "Look at me, Clara. Keep your eyes on me." She did. She anchored herself to the sheer, uncompromising violence in his jaw, trusting his strength as they sprinted toward the towering, shadowy mountains of stacked timber looming in the distance. They breached the edge of the lumber yard, throwing themselves behind the first massive stack of redwoods just as the rhythmic thwip, thwip, thwip of silenced gunfire chewed through the mud exactly where they had been running. Clara collapsed against the rough, fragrant bark, her lungs burning, screaming for air. Hayes pressed himself entirely over her, shielding her body with his own as he peered around the edge of the timber. "They're flanking," Hayes growled, gripping the axe handle so hard his knuckles turned white. He reached for his belt to grab his radio to warn his crew. Before his fingers even brushed the dial, the massive, blinding halogen floodlights illuminating the lumber yard buzzed violently and simultaneously shattered. The backup grid groaned, whined, and died. The trackers had just blown the main power grid. Welcome to the dark. The darkness inside the lumber yard was absolute, claustrophobic, and suffocating. The towering stacks of redwoods blocked out even the ambient light of the storm, creating a sprawling, terrifying maze of dead ends and narrow corridors. "Move," Hayes whispered, his lips grazing the shell of her ear. The deep vibration of his voice sent an involuntary shiver straight down her spine that had absolutely nothing to do with the freezing rain. He didn't let go of her waist. He navigated the pitch-black labyrinth entirely by touch and memory, pulling her seamlessly through narrow gaps between the massive logs. Clara forced her panic down, forcing her analytical mind to override her terror. "They won't split up entirely," Clara whispered back, her hands gripping the soaking wet fabric of his heavy coat. The hounds sweep in overlapping V formations. They use thermal imaging, but the freezing rain will blur their long-range scanners. They have to get close. "Let them get close," Hayes rasped darkly. "I've got 10 pounds of steel that says their thermals won't help them in close quarters." "Hayes, you can't fight an entire squad with an axe." He suddenly hauled her backward, violently silencing her as he pressed her completely flush into a narrow, vertical fissure between two towering redwood trunks. The space was impossibly tight. There was barely room to breathe. Clara's back scraped against the rough bark, and Hayes was forced to press his massive body entirely against hers to fit inside the shadow. His heavy chest crushed against her breasts, his muscular thighs slotted perfectly between hers. She gasped at the overwhelming, sudden friction, the sound instantly swallowed by his calloused hand clamping firmly over her mouth. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Heavy, synchronized boots approached the gravelly mud directly outside their hiding spot. Clara went entirely rigid. Underneath his hand, her breathing stopped. Hayes's dark eyes locked onto hers in the pitch black. The physical proximity was agonizing. She could feel the heavy, frantic thudding of his heart directly against hers. The heat radiating off his soaked skin was a furnace, completely overriding the freezing rain. The scent of him, sharp pine, heavy alpha musk, and lethal adrenaline, was intoxicating, making her head spin dangerously. He wasn't looking at the opening. He was looking at her, his gaze holding an intense, possessive promise that he would tear the forest down before he let anyone touch her. Two hounds walked slowly past their narrow fissure. Clara could see the faint, eerie green glow of their night vision goggles sweeping the shadows. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying the sheer heat rolling off Hayes's body wouldn't light up their thermal scopes. The footsteps paused. Heat signature. Faint, bleeding through the storm interference. A synthesized metallic voice whispered over a localized comms unit. Clara's eyes snapped open. The tracker had stopped exactly parallel to their hiding spot. He turned slowly, the green lenses staring directly into the fissure. Hayes shifted his weight, preparing to lunge, but there was no room to swing the heavy axe. The tracker didn't shout a warning. He simply raised a high-powered suppressed tranquilizer rifle, a red laser sight cutting through the darkness to settle perfectly, terrifyingly, onto the center of Clara's pregnant stomach. Time completely fractured. Before the hound's finger could even pull the trigger, Hayes moved. He didn't try to swing the massive felling axe in the confined space. Instead, he ripped a heavy, solid iron lug wrench from his tactical belt and hurled it with devastating, terrifying velocity. The heavy iron caught the tracker squarely in the throat with a sickening, wet crunch. The rifle fired wildly, the tranquilizer dart burying itself deep into the redwood bark exactly an inch above Clara's shoulder. The hound collapsed backward into the mud, his partner instantly dropping to a knee and raising an automatic weapon toward the shadows. "Run!" Hayes roared, and shoving Clara out the opposite side of the fissure just as a hail of suppressed bullets shredded the bark exactly where they had been standing. They tore through the labyrinth, Hayes practically throwing her around a massive stack of timber to avoid a sweeping thermal scan. "The main garage!" he barked over the storm, pointing toward a massive, reinforced steel building at the edge of the yard. "We need heavy armor." Clara didn't argue. Her lungs were burning, her legs threatening to give out completely, but the sheer guilt driving her forward was stronger than her exhaustion. She was dragging Hayes into a slaughter. They burst out of the stacks, sprinting across the open mud toward the towering steel bay doors of the garage. Hayes hit the manual release, throwing his massive weight against the rusted chain to haul the door up just enough for them to slide underneath. He slammed it shut behind them, throwing the heavy iron deadbolt. The interior of the garage was cavernous and smelled sharply of diesel and metal shavings. In the center of the bay sat the heavy logging rigs, machines the size of small houses, built of reinforced steel, thick treads, and bullet-resistant safety glass. "Get in the cab," Hayes ordered. Already moving toward the largest rig, a massive, custom-built feller-buncher with a heavily fortified cabin. "What are you doing?" Clara demanded, her voice cracking as she chased him. He didn't answer. He grabbed her by the waist, his massive hands spanning her sides, and effortlessly hoisted her up onto the heavy steel treads of the machine. He opened the heavy door of the cab, practically shoving her into the leather driver's seat. "Hayes, stop," she pleaded, scrambling to grab his soaking wet collar before he could pull away. "You are not leaving me in here while you fight them out there. I know how they move." "I don't care how they move," Hayes snarled, his abrasive mask completely shattering. He grabbed her wrists, his grip tight, frantic, and entirely desperate. "I care about 2 inches of reinforced steel between you and those rifles. You lock this door, Clara. You do not open it for anyone." "I am not letting you die for me," she sobbed, a violent, helpless anger ripping through her chest. He leaned in, his face inches from hers. The sheer, overwhelming heat of his gaze pinned her entirely to the seat. "I am the alpha of this territory," he growled, a low, territorial rumble vibrating deep in his chest. "And I protect what is mine." Before she could process the weight of his words, he slammed the heavy steel door of the cab shut. The thick, mechanized locks engaged instantly. She was trapped in a glass and steel cage. Clara threw herself against the bullet-resistant window, slamming her fists against the glass. "Hayes, no!" she screamed, though she knew he couldn't hear her over the storm and the thick insulation. Outside the rig, Hayes didn't look back. He turned slowly, his broad, scarred shoulders rolling as he stepped back into the center of the empty garage bay. He tightened his grip on the massive, double-bitted felling axe, the steel resting heavily against his thigh. The screech of metal echoed violently through the cavernous space. The heavy side doors of the garage were kicked open. 3 silver hounds stepped into the bay, their thermal visors glowing eerily in the dark, automatic weapons raised and aimed perfectly at the center of Hayes's chest. He didn't raise his hands. He didn't step back. The arrogant lumberjack smiled, a terrifying, blood-chilling smirk, and raised the heavy axe. The heavy, bullet-resistant glass of the Fellerbuncher cab muted the sheer violence erupting in the garage bay, turning the slaughter into a horrifying, silent film. Clara slammed her hands against the reinforced window, her breath fogging the cold glass. Below her, the 3 silver hounds spread out, their suppressed automatic weapons sweeping in a terrifyingly synchronized arc. They didn't shout demands. They didn't hesitate. They simply opened fire. Hayes didn't duck. He didn't dive for cover. He moved with a brutal, terrifying velocity that absolutely defied his massive size. He launched himself horizontally, sliding across the grease-slicked concrete floor just as the hail of bullets chewed through the heavy wooden workbench exactly where he'd been standing seconds before. He used the momentum to close the gap, his heavy steel-toed boots slamming violently into the kneecap of the closest tracker. The sickening crack of bone was entirely audible, even through the thick insulation of the cab. The tracker went down hard. Hayes didn't even pause. He swung the massive, double-bitted felling axe in a devastating upward arc, burying the blunt iron back of the blade squarely into the second man's tactical vest. The sheer kinetic force lifted the hound entirely off his feet, launching him backward into a stack of oil drums with a deafening metallic crash. Clara's heart hammered frantically against her ribs, the adrenaline turning her blood to ice. The third tracker, the squad leader, was faster. He dropped his rifle, recognizing the close-quarters disadvantage, and drew a wickedly curved, silver-plated combat knife. He lunged, the blade slicing a jagged, bloody line right through the heavy canvas of Hayes's coat and deep into his shoulder. Hayes roared, a deep, visceral sound that vibrated right through the steel treads of the machine Clara was trapped inside. "No!" Clara screamed, though the sound bounced uselessly off the reinforced glass. She couldn't just watch him bleed out on the concrete. She spun around, ripping her eyes away from the fight to stare at the massive, complicated control panel of the logging rig. It was an intimidating sea of levers, hydraulic switches, and unlit dials. But there were no keys in the ignition. Clara dropped to her knees in the cramped space, entirely ignoring the agonizing cramp in her stomach. She shoved her hands under the steering column, her grease-stained fingers frantically clawing at the heavy plastic casing. "Come on! Come on!" she gasped, her fingernails breaking as she finally ripped the access panel free. A nest of thick, colored wires tumbled into her lap. She had spent entirely too many nights locked in a gilded, high-security penthouse, learning exactly how to short-circuit electronic locks. An industrial diesel engine wasn't that different. She grabbed the heavy red ignition wire and the stripped black grounding cable. Outside, Hayes took another brutal hit, staggering backward against the massive treads of the rig. His dark eyes flicked upward, locking onto hers through the glass for a fraction of a second. There was no fear in his gaze, only absolute, devastating surrender to the violence required to keep her alive. Clara struck the wires together. A shower of blue sparks erupted, burning her knuckles, but the massive diesel engine beneath her coughed violently. It shuddered, groaned, and then roared to life with a deafening, mechanical shriek. She didn't try to drive the rig. Instead, she slammed her entire forearm onto the master switchboard, hitting every single toggle simultaneously. The massive, stadium-grade halogen headlights mounted on the front and top of the Fellerbuncher flared instantly. The blinding, million candle power beams flooded the dim garage, catching the squad leader perfectly in the open. The sheer intensity of the light completely overpowered his thermal night vision goggles, blinding him instantly. He shrieked, dropping the silver knife to claw frantically at his smoking visor. Hayes didn't waste the opening. He lunged forward, grabbing the blinded tracker by the tactical vest and hurling him violently across the bay. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the deafening rumble of the idling diesel engine. Hayes stood in the center of the carnage, his chest heaving, his shoulder bleeding freely onto the concrete. He looked up at the cab, a terrifying, blood-stained smirk breaking across his scarred face. He nodded once, a silent, absolute acknowledgement of their partnership. But the victory lasted exactly 3 seconds. The squad leader, groaning on the floor near the open bay doors, reached weakly into his heavy tactical pouch. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled a heavy, cylindrical explosive, yanking the pin with his teeth. He didn't throw it at Hayes. He tossed it directly into the massive, open vat of sawdust and discarded diesel fuel sitting at the rear of the garage. The concussive blast completely liquefied the air inside the garage. The explosion wasn't a fireball. It was a devastating shockwave of concussive force that shattered every single window in the massive steel building simultaneously. The heavy, reinforced glass of the Feller-Buncher cab webbed instantly, a terrifying mosaic of cracks shooting across Clara's vision before the glass blew inward. She threw her arms over her face, screaming as the shockwave threw her violently against the back wall of the cabin. The ringing in her ears was absolute. She couldn't hear the storm. She couldn't hear the engine. All she could smell was the sickening, suffocating stench of vaporized diesel fuel and incinerated pine. The vat of sawdust had ignited, sending a literal tidal wave of fire rolling across the grease-slicked concrete floor. The garage was entirely ablaze, the flames crawling rapidly up the timber support beams. "Clara!" The voice cut through the ringing, hoarse, desperate, and completely unhinged. The heavy steel door of the cab was violently ripped open. Hayes reached inside, completely ignoring the jagged glass slicing into his heavily scarred forearms. He grabbed her by the heavy canvas coat and hauled her out of the ruined cab, and crushing her instantly against his chest. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands frantically roaming over her face, checking for shrapnel. "Tell me you aren't hit." I'm okay," she gasped, coughing violently as the thick, black smoke began to fill the cavernous space. The heat radiating off the burning garage was staggering, but it was absolutely nothing compared to the sheer, desperate heat of Hayes's body. He was trembling, not from the fight, but from the paralyzing terror of almost losing her. The intoxicating scent of him was heavily masked by smoke and copper blood, but it still grounded her instantly. "We have to move," Hayes rasped, his arm wrapping like an iron band around her waist. "The fuel lines on these rigs are going to detonate in less than 2 minutes. The entire building is coming down." He dragged her toward the rear of the garage, the only section not entirely swallowed by the firewall. But the main bay doors were completely blocked by a collapsed, burning support beam. "The side access," Clara choked out, pointing blindly through the smoke. "It's locked from the outside," Hayes countered, pulling her tighter against his side as a secondary explosion rocked the far wall. "And sniper fire is going to cut us to ribbons the second we step out of the cover of this building." "We don't have a choice," she yelled, her eyes burning from the acrid smoke. She pressed her face directly into the crook of his neck, seeking the last pocket of clean air against his skin. "I am not burning to death in your incredibly expensive workshop." Hayes let out a harsh, gravelly laugh that sounded more like a bark. "Hold on to me, Spitfire, tightly." He didn't head for the door. He turned them entirely toward a massive, reinforced, frosted glass window at the rear of the bay. He gripped his felling axe with his free hand. Without breaking stride, he swung the massive iron head directly into the center of the frosted glass. It shattered outward in a spectacular explosion of shards. "Cover your head," he roared. He wrapped both arms entirely around her, lifting her off her feet, and physically threw his massive body through the jagged, open window frame, just as the first massive logging rig behind them exploded. The force of the blast propelled them forward into the freezing rain. They slammed into the soft, deep mud of the lumber yard, Hayes perfectly absorbing the brutal impact of the fall with his own back to keep her safe. They rolled twice, entirely coated in freezing slush, before slamming to a halt against a stack of wet pine. Clara gasped, the icy air instantly shocking her burning lungs. She scrambled to sit up, her hands frantically checking Hayes's chest. He was groaning, his eyes squeezed shut against the pain. "You absolute idiot!" she sobbed, swiping the mud from his face with a trembling hand. "You could have broken your neck." "I told you," he grunted, slowly opening his eyes to lock onto hers. His dark gaze was burning with an intensity that completely eclipsed the raging inferno of the garage behind them. "I protect what is mine." The romantic tension spiked, thick and undeniable, completely freezing the chaos around them. He reached up, his calloused thumb tracing the line of her jaw. How incredibly touching. The smooth, chillingly calm voice completely shattered the moment. Clara froze. Slowly, she turned her head. Standing 10 feet away in the freezing mud, completely untouched by the blast and holding a highly modified, suppressed tactical rifle perfectly aimed at Hayes's skull, was the squad leader of the Silver Hounds. His face was badly burned from the halogen lights, but his smile was pure, aristocratic sadism. "The boss really wants you back, little bird," the tracker purred, racking the slide of the rifle with a terrifying metallic clack. But he didn't say anything about the lumberjack. The rain hammered down, turning the ground beneath them into a freezing, slippery quagmire. The blazing ruins of the garage cast towering, demonic shadows across the massive stacks of redwoods surrounding them. Clara didn't scream. She didn't cower. A profound, absolutely terrifying stillness washed over her. The squad leader thought he had trapped a frightened, exhausted Omega. He didn't realize she had spent the last 3 days learning how to hunt in the dark alongside an apex predator. Clara slowly pushed herself to her feet, entirely ignoring the agonizing pain in her muscles. She stood directly between the barrel of the suppressed rifle and Hayes's prone body. "Move aside, little bird," the squad leader warned, his burned face twisting into a grimace. "Or I'll put the first round through your leg. The boss wants you alive, but he doesn't care if you can walk." Clara let out a dry, hollow laugh that echoed chillingly over the roar of the fire. "You really don't get it." "I do you," she taunted, her voice dripping with pure, weaponized sarcasm. She took a slow, deliberate step backward, subtly guiding the tracker's aim away from Hayes. "You burned down a garage. Congratulations. But you are currently standing in the absolute center of a mechanized lumber yard, and you didn't even bother to look up." The tracker frowned, his finger tightening incrementally on the trigger. "What are you talking about?" Clara didn't answer him. She didn't have to. She dropped her gaze down to Hayes. He was still lying in the mud, but his eyes were wide open, locked perfectly onto hers. They didn't need words. The silent, agonizingly intense communication flowing between them was absolute. Ride or die. Hayes's massive hand shot out, completely unseen in the dark mud, his fingers wrapping around a heavy, braided steel cable partially buried in the slush. "You really should have looked up," Clara whispered. Hayes violently yanked the release cable. High above them, hidden entirely in the darkness of the storm, The heavy, rusted locking pins of a massive, industrial log-stacking crane snapped open with a sound like a cannon blast. The squad leader jerked his head upward, the thermal visor useless against the sheer, crushing gravity of what was coming down. 10 tons of raw, unprocessed redwood timber plummeted from the sky. The tracker shrieked, diving wildly to the left, but he was too slow. The massive logs hit the muddy earth with an apocalyptic, earth-shattering crash, completely burying the space where the tracker had just been standing. The ground violently shuddered, throwing Clara entirely off her feet. The shockwave of mud and pulverized bark blasted over them. When the deafening roar finally settled, leaving only the hissing of the rain and the crackle of the burning garage, the silence in the yard was absolute. A massive, impenetrable wall of timber now blocked the only exit from their section of the labyrinth. The remaining trackers of the squad were completely cut off. Clara sat up in the mud, her chest heaving, her entire body shaking with the delayed adrenaline crash. She stared at the mountain of logs, unable to process the fact that they had actually survived. Spitfire. The low, gravelly rasp came from the darkness to her right. Hayes was slowly pushing himself upright, leaning heavily against a stack of pine. His face was pale, the blood from the knife wound soaking completely through his ruined canvas coat. He looked completely shattered, entirely spent, but his dark eyes were burning with an overwhelming, desperate relief. Clara didn't hesitate. She scrambled across the freezing mud on her hands and knees, completely throwing herself into his massive chest. Hayes caught her, his huge arms wrapping around her with crushing, possessive force. He buried his face into the crook of her neck, his harsh, ragged breathing completely warming her freezing skin. The abrasive, arrogant mask was gone. He was just a man, holding on to the only thing he had ever truly been terrified to lose. "You did it," he murmured against her collarbone, his voice breaking. "God, you actually did it." "We did it," she corrected softly, her hands tangling desperately in his wet hair. The physical proximity was no longer just tension. It was a deep, undeniable, and soul-crushing bond. The slow burn had entirely caught fire. They stayed there in the mud, clinging to each other as the storm raged above them, finally safe within the fortress they had built together. For the first time in months, Clara actually felt a terrifying, overwhelming sense of hope. Clack, clack, clack. The sharp, metallic sound echoed cleanly through the rain, cutting directly through the quiet aftermath. Hayes froze. He slowly pulled back, his dark eyes shifting from Clara's face toward the top of the massive pile of fallen redwoods. A figure was standing at the absolute peak of the timber pile, illuminated perfectly by a sudden flash of lightning. He wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing an immaculate, perfectly tailored charcoal suit completely untouched by the mud. He held a silver-plated revolver lazily in his right hand. Clara's blood turned to absolute ice. The air completely vanished from her lungs. "Well?" her ex said, his smooth, aristocratic voice carrying effortlessly over the wind. He smiled down at them, a chilling, perfectly composed expression of absolute ownership. "This has been incredibly entertaining, but playtime is over, darling. It's time to come home." Clara stared up at the immaculate, perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the sheer absurdity of his pristine appearance amidst the mud and carnage hitting her like a physical blow. Her ex, Julian, stood perfectly balanced on the pulverized redwoods, an arrogant, untouchable god looking down at his ruined playground. He held a custom, silver-plated revolver lazily in his right hand, completely unbothered by the freezing rain slicking his dark hair. "Julian," she breathed, the name tasting like ash and old copper on her tongue. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic, Clara," he purred, his voice projecting effortlessly over the crackle of the burning garage. He aimed the silver-plated barrel directly at Hayes's chest, running away into the mud, playing house with a lumberjack. It's terribly cliché, darling, but I didn't come all this way to dirty my own hands. Julian smiled, a chilling, hollow expression that never quite reached his eyes, and snapped his fingers. It was a sharp, dismissive sound that somehow cut perfectly through the ambient roar of the storm. From the deep, impenetrable shadows of the collapsed timber, the burned squad leader erupted. He hadn't been crushed. He lunged directly at Clara, moving with a feral, terrifying desperation, a silver-plated combat knife drawn and gleaming in the firelight. Hayes didn't hesitate. He didn't even blink. He threw himself between them, his massive body colliding violently with the tracker just as the blade swung downward. They went down hard into the freezing mud, a brutal, thrashing tangle of limbs and lethal intent. The sheer heat radiating from Hayes's back was a furnace as he shielded her, his heavy scent of adrenaline, crushed pine, and metallic blood entirely overpowering the acrid smoke of the garage. "Hayes!" Clara shrieked, scrambling backward in the slush on her hands and knees. Hayes took a vicious, sickening punch to the jaw, his head snapping back, but he countered instantly with a devastating elbow that cracked the tracker's ribs. The sound was horribly loud in the confined space of the labyrinth. But the hound was relentless, fueled by pure, unadulterated desperation and the watchful eye of his employer. He slashed blindly in the dark, forcing Hayes onto his back in the freezing, waterlogged mud. Clara's sarcastic shield completely disintegrated. There was no room for witty deflections when the man who had laid down his life for her was drowning in the slush. Pure, unfiltered survival instinct took over. She searched the ground frantically, her hands sinking deep into the freezing muck until her numb fingers grazed something heavy and uncompromisingly hard. A discarded, heavy-duty logging chain. She hauled it out of the mud, the heavy, rusted links clinking violently against each other. She didn't have the upper body strength to swing it as a weapon, and not against a trained assassin. But Hayes did. "Hayes!" she screamed, her voice tearing painfully in her throat. She threw the chain laterally across the ground. It slid perfectly through the slush, the heavy iron stopping mere inches from Hayes's outstretched, grasping hand. He wrapped his massive, calloused fist around the iron links, his knuckles turning instantly white. But above him, the squad leader regained his balance. He raised the silver blade high into the air, the firelight catching the polished metal, aiming a lethal, two-handed downward strike squarely at the exposed center of Hayes's chest. Time seemed to completely fracture, snapping into terrifyingly slow motion. Hayes twisted violently in the mud, throwing his massive shoulder forward just as the silver blade descended. The weapon missed his heart, but it sank deeply into his side, tearing brutally through heavy canvas, muscle, and grinding sickeningly against his ribs. A terrifying, guttural roar ripped from Hayes's throat, a sound of pure, primal agony that made Clara's own heart physically stutter in her chest. He didn't grab the wound. He didn't flinch away. He used his free hand to whip the heavy logging chain upward in a brutal, devastatingly fast arc. The thick iron caught the squad leader perfectly across the temple. The sheer kinetic force of the blow lifted the tracker off his knees, his eyes rolling back before he collapsed like a stone into the freezing sludge, entirely motionless. Above them, Julian's perfectly composed smile faltered. Seeing his elite, highly trained commander completely pulverized by a wounded lumberjack, the aristocratic facade cracked. He slowly lowered his revolver, taking a deliberate step backward into the shadows of the timber. "You've made your point, darling," Julian called out, his voice tight and dripping with venom. but I have an entire convoy waiting at the base of this mountain. You can't hide in the mud forever. This isn't over." He turned, melting entirely into the dark woods toward the main gates. The immediate threat was neutralized. The camp was suddenly, violently silent, leaving only the hiss of the rain. "Hayes," Clara gasped, throwing herself forward, her knees slamming painfully into the rocks hidden beneath the mud. He tried to push himself up on his elbows, his massive chest heaving frantically, but his arms completely gave out. He collapsed backward into the slush, a terrifying wet wheezing sound rattling deep in his lungs. The rain was washing the blood from his side in sickening dark rivers that stained the puddles around them entirely crimson. "No, no, no," she sobbed, pressing both of her freezing hands directly over the gaping wound. The heat of his blood was a sharp, horrifying contrast to the icy rain. His skin, usually radiating a comforting, magnetic warmth, was rapidly turning cold. His dark eyes were losing focus, drifting toward the black sky. "Spitfire," he grunted, his heavy, calloused hand reaching up to weakly grasp her wrist. His grip, usually so possessing and strong, was terrifyingly fragile. Did he touch you?" "He didn't touch me," she cried, leaning her face down until her forehead rested directly against his. "I'm right here. I'm safe. But you have to stay with me, Hayes. Do you hear me? You do not get to leave me here." He smiled, a faint, ghostly curve of his lips that lacked all his usual arrogance. "Stubborn to the end." His eyes rolled back, and his massive body went entirely limp beneath her hands. Above them, the torrential rain abruptly stopped. The storm had broken, leaving behind an eerie, suffocating silence as Clara realized the heavy, steady thud of Hayes's heart was rapidly fading beneath her blood-soaked hands. The foreman's office smelled sharply of industrial rubbing alcohol, old sawdust, and raw, unfiltered terror. It had taken 4 of the strongest men in the camp to carry Hayes's massive, dead-weight frame onto the heavy wooden desk in the center of the room. Clara hadn't let go of his hand the entire time. She stood rigidly beside the camp medic, her clothes completely soaked in freezing mud and Hayes's blood, entirely oblivious to her own exhaustion. "Hold pressure here, tightly," the medic barked, ripping open a vacuum-sealed field trauma kit with his teeth. The blade missed the lung by a fraction of an inch, but the arterial bleeding is severe. I need to clamp it. Clara pressed the thick stack of gauze against his side, throwing her entire, trembling body weight into it. Her sarcastic walls were completely pulverized into dust. The witty banter she used as an impenetrable shield against the world was completely useless here. Looking at his heavily scarred chest, pale and shuddering violently beneath her hands, the truth hit her with the undeniable force of a falling redwood. She was entirely, terrifyingly in love with him. He wasn't just a brutal, arrogant alpha protecting a piece of territory. He was a man who had taken a silver blade to the ribs just to ensure she could take another breath. The sheer, overwhelming heat returning faintly to his skin beneath her palms was the only thing anchoring her to sanity. She traded the pristine, sterile, and cold captivity of Julian's world for a muddy, bloody, and fiercely protective reality. And she wouldn't trade it back for anything. Hayes drifted violently in and out of consciousness as the medic worked. His massive fingers continually twitched, searching blindly on the edge of the desk until they tangled tightly with hers. "Spitfire," he mumbled, his voice a gravelly, delirious rasp that broke her heart entirely in two. "Behind me. Stay behind me." "I'm right here," she whispered fiercely, tears cutting clean, hot tracks through the soot on her face. She squeezed his hand, leaning in so he could catch her scent. "I'm not running anymore. I'm right here. I promise." The hours bled together in a grueling haze of bloody gauze, sharp metallic clinks of surgical tools, and whispered, desperate pleas. Slowly, agonizingly, the medic managed to clamp the artery and stabilize the wound, stitching the jagged flesh closed with thick, black thread. The heavy, frantic atmosphere in the room slowly gave way to a quiet, exhausted relief as Hayes's breathing finally deepened into a steady rhythm. Clara collapsed into a heavy wooden chair beside the desk, her head resting gently near Hayes's uninjured shoulder, her nose buried deeply in the lingering scent of pine and rain on his skin. Just as the first pale, gray light of dawn crept tentatively through the shattered window, Hayes's chest hitched. He exhaled a long, heavy breath and slowly opened his eyes. They were completely clear, fully lucid, and entirely, exclusively focused on her. "Come closer," he rumbled. The camp outside was tentatively coming back to life. Loggers were silently clearing the wreckage in the mud, the heavy, methodical scrape of chainsaws replacing the terrifying echo of suppressed gunfire. Inside the dim office, the quiet was deeply, overwhelmingly intimate. Clara leaned over Hayes, carefully wiping a smudge of dried mud and dried blood from his collarbone with a damp cloth. The physical proximity wasn't charged with frantic adrenaline anymore. It was heavy with a profound, unspoken acceptance. The slow burn had finally, entirely caught fire. "You look terrible. See, Spitfire," Hayes murmured, his voice incredibly weak but still vibrating with that familiar, arrogant warmth that made her stomach flutter. "You have absolutely no room to talk," she replied, a watery, breathless laugh escaping her lips. "You look like you lost a fight with a meat grinder. And for the record, your bedside manner is appalling." Hayes shifted slightly on the desk, grimacing as the fresh stitches pulled taut, but his massive hand came up to cup her cheek. The rough calluses rasped gently against her skin, sending a jolt of pure, undeniable heat straight to her core. He didn't pull away. He let his thumb rest softly against her bottom lip, his dark eyes completely stripping away the last of his guarded, isolated burden. He wasn't hiding behind his gruff exterior anymore. "I told you," Hayes swore, the vow heavy and absolute in the quiet room, his gaze dropping to her mouth before returning to her eyes. "I'd burn this entire mountain to ash before I let them put you back in a cage, Clara." She leaned into his palm, closing her eyes, finally allowing herself to feel the crushing, beautiful weight of his protection without fighting it. The vulnerability between them was raw and entirely exposing. The storm had finally broken, leaving behind the sharp scent of ozone and pulverized pine. Inside the dim, wreckage-strewn foreman's office, Clara's trembling hands finally steadied as she finished wrapping the bloody, improvised bandage around Hayes's scarred torso. For the first time, his gruff, abrasive mask was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, burning gaze that pinned her in place. The undeniable spark between them flared into a raging fire as he reached out, his calloused thumb gently brushing the mud from her cheek. "You're safe now, Spitfire," he murmured, the words a gravelly vow. She leaned into his touch, finally exhaling a breath she felt she'd held for months. Then, the grinding screech of metal tore through the quiet. The fortified iron gates groaned and gave way. Headlights pierced the gloom. A pristine, heavily armored convoy rolled smoothly into the mud. Her ex had arrived.